What's up, folks? Today, we are going to do an analysis of the Declaration of Independence so that we know what every single one of the little charges that Thomas Jefferson levies against the king are, and we're going to learn about the lost paragraph. So, how this is going to work. I am going to read the Declaration of Independence bit by bit to you. Every so often, I'm going to stop and explain. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. He is just straight up telling the Brits, we're separating, letting you know, dear king, we're done here. And to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Not only are we leaving, we're not gonna go be some colony of France or Spain or get protection from Portugal. No, we're a country now. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The opinions of mankind. He wants others to know why they're separating. Thomas Jefferson was an ideologue. He believed in ideas more than actions by a lot. He was heavily agrarian utopian, thinking that all Americans were just going to be able to farm on their own little plot of land and live happy, secluded lives until the end of time. He believed that eventually the world, in practicality, would come around to the beautiful ideas he came up with in his head. Paragraph 2, which is juicy. We hold these truths to be self-evident. You know the rest of the sentence. It's one of the most famous sentences in American history. But I want you to know that that self-evident is a dig. He's insulting the king. That it's not clearly evident to you. We think it's self-evident over here. That all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Iconic. It really sets the American ethos, right? You do what you want. You get to live doing what you want, free of persecution. The pursuit of happiness. Amongst critics, it is seen as a bit of a cop-out because they initially took life, liberty, and they put in the pursuit of happiness, but John Locke, who was this philosopher fella at the time, said life, liberty, and property. A lot's been made about the fact that the founding fathers left property out. I don't make too much of it because I think that Thomas Jefferson was an idealistic fella, and the pursuit of happiness kind of meaning, and you get to go and try to do what you want. It's certainly not as definitive as property. There's an argument that happiness includes property, that it's broad, and that in order to be happy and in a functioning society, you have to be able to accumulate things free from the force of government. I think it's pretty. And he uses happiness. He uses it more times in here than just that one phrase. All right, the next portion. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. He's saying that when you're being so bad that I can't trust you to protect me, which is the fundamental trade that we're making. I abide by the rules of my government, and my government protects me from harm and theft and all of the things which we want protecting from. Well, when that doesn't work anymore, we're making a new one with the hopes of securing both our safety and our happiness. And I think that this makes happiness kind of a more salient word than property would be. Because to say like your safety and your property, like, I don't know, it just sounds so money bags. But your safety and your happiness, even if your village got burnt down, even if you actually lost all of your property, you would want to be safe and to have an opportunity to be happy. In this next portion, Thomas Jefferson grapples openly with the issues of leaving a government. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Prudence will dictate means it's worth taking note of the fact that governments that have been here a long time and have mostly done a good job probably shouldn't be overthrown for little encroachments, for just a minor misstep, for light and transient causes. The tax on plastic bags or something like that. But we're writing a Declaration of Independence. And we know this. We're acknowledging that you probably shouldn't cut ties with a pretty good government. You have to understand that we would have suffered while the evils were sufferable. In other words, we would have put up with the problems if they were problems that we could live under. But these problems are so bad that we can't continue to live under this kind of government. That's a fundamental American thing. The American ethos of activity. John Stuart Mill talks about having either an active population or a passive population. Passive meaning that you just put up with the things that the government shoves down your throat. And active people, on the other hand, do not put up with shenanigans. They're protesting, they're changing people in office, they're calling for re-elections, they're putting referendums in. That's an active people. The American ethos, I think, is summed up in many ways by this next sentence. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. It is their right, it is their duty. Duty. I like that. Fundamentally, America and Americans take ownership. It's on us to make sure that this doesn't all get out of hand. It's our right, yes. It's also our duty. And we do take that seriously. Both sides of the political aisle and the people in between. Everybody has protests. Everybody has a pet issue. Everybody is yelling about something. They're trying to change something. And that is an active participation. Now, sometimes that can go overboard and you can get too many people active in one direction that does not turn out to be good long term, such as the drawbacks of democracy. But as long as you have an active people and you can somehow encourage them morally, which this line kind of does, you're encouraging them morally to take action against oppression, against the sinister sides of human nature, and to not accept it. When they see it, to overthrow it. That is one of the pillars of American culture. After saying all of this in relatively general terms, he has essentially not said anything directly at anybody, not at the king, not at England, not at nothing, right? He's just been living in the abstract as a good ideologue does. But now he's ready to point some fingers. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So this entire clause after the dash, when he starts at such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, it's all a direct accusation, except for the final sentence. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. It's really a message to everyone. And not everybody was reading at this time, right? So by everyone, I really mean all of the people who could potentially be interested in Britain's large and prosperous colonies seceding. He's tweeting to the King of France. He's tweeting to the King of Spain. He's tweeting at Portugal. He is putting this out so that other people can see it. They can see what you've done, and hopefully they can help us. It's pretty gangster, isn't it? To go up against the biggest power of the day and just send out a letter that's like, you guys are rude. We're leaving. Imagine Puerto Rico putting out a tweet to the entire world saying it's leaving the U.S. because of this, and this. The U.S. didn't help during the hurricanes, what have you. Now, everyone in the world knows. And more importantly, other countries who would rather the U.S. be less successful because it's a threat to them, they would go and back Puerto Rico. It would be crazy though, right? Because we're America. We'll fly big helicopters over your place and planes that flatten your land. We can do all kinds of crazy stuff. That was the British. We were Puerto Rico in this British to America feud, right? The Brits controlled Earth. They rode around on the seas. They did what they wanted with relative impunity. They were fighting the French, but it's the French. You know, they were constantly expanding. They were pretty wealthy. They were the biggest, most scariest military threat of the day. And their colony just said bye. So these are the facts being submitted to a candid world. He has refused to assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. The government can't do anything other than pass laws. If they want to raise money for something, they got to pass a law for it. The king had sent over governors that were doing his bidding. They were consistently blocking the state legislatures from passing laws, things from blocking the slave trade to making sure they had proper equipment for garrisons, for fighting on the frontier. They were not given an ability to pass really anything for the decade or so leading up to the revolution. So that was frustrating them. On top of that, when the governors did something that the king didn't like, he would say, look, nothing's getting passed until I approve it. And then the paperwork would pile up, and the king would never look at it, which is a de facto veto. He just said, nah, you can't do it, but he didn't have to say that. This is one of the reasons that in our Constitution, there's the 10 days rule, that if the president doesn't return a bill within 10 days, it's automatically passed into law because the people wanted it in Congress, and you can't just sit there and do nothing. And therefore, it doesn't get passed, because that would be a very strong power. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. I love this line. I love this charge against the king, because this charge brings us back to the mid-1770s. At the time, Americans wanted people there. They wanted anybody that wanted to migrate. They were very happy that you migrated there. It was good to have a growing population. Their economy kept booming. They were trying to be a productive empire in their own right. They were colonies, but they were kind of running themselves in some ways. And when they started having problems with the king, he started blocking migration. And the migration that they did get, the king said, you can't have that land unless you just don't have a voice in the legislature in your state. And therefore the king could control more of the political action that happened, and a whole swath of people that would be under it couldn't do anything. But to the regular person, the reason he says, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only, is the only reason you would want to do that is to collect their rights and do bad things to them. Because you wouldn't care if you were going to be cool. You'd be like, vote, who cares? But that's not what was happening. And the regular person, the regular dude just trying to get 40 acres and a mule, he doesn't care. You're going to give me 40 acres to build my life on, and all I got to do is not vote? Sure. Right? So you can get a lot of people with that, and the only thing you're going to use that for, especially if you're putting it as the clause or one of the clauses for getting land, the only thing you're going to use it for is nefarious or bad actions. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. The king was tired of the colony's governments passing laws that he didn't like. So he started to mess with them. He would call together their legislator in a town on the other side of the state that doesn't have the infrastructure for it. And that might not sound like the world's biggest deal now, but to get across the state might take a week at that time. You're riding a horse all day. You get chafed. It involves chafing, getting called to a different location. And then you get there and there's not even a building. You gotta do Congress in the park. Nobody wants that. It's uncomfortable. And another huge thing to recognize is their entire database at the time of laws is on paper at the Congress building. So all of the things that they reference, their desks, all that stuff, they don't have access to it. And then if they want to carry it, they got to pack it all up, put it on another horse. I mean, how many horses do these guys have? He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. So this was a thing that up until relatively recently in Britain, the kings could do. They could just dissolve the government. If the government was going crazy, if Parliament was like, we want the king to give us crumpets, fish and chips every day, whatever they wanted, if the king thought it was too much, he would just dissolve their government and then pray that there was not a revolution. But the overthrowing of the government, called dissolving the government, was a right of the king at the time. So then hopefully some other people would get in there, or maybe the king could give some money for some elections, and then lo and behold, Parliament's not getting so frisky. When the colonies were upset, Congress in America would vote, and then it'd get written down, and then somebody would put it in a letter on a ship, and they'd sail it across the ocean, and then 3 months later the king would read it, and you go, Jesus Christ, these colonies. I think their government's done. We're dissolving the government. That's what we're doing, okay? Draft a letter, okay? Your government is hereby dissolved. Thank you. Colonists were upset because they were like, what's the point of having a parliament if you just make it disappear whenever it does something for us that you don't like? Why represent us if our voice won't matter in the end anyways? And then shortly thereafter, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, where they declared that they got to legislate for all the states, no matter what, in all cases whatsoever. And the states were like, dude, this is crazy. You guys live in Europe. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. The state remaining, in the meantime, exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. The king was not only upset at the colonists and their little congresses, but he was extra upset when he would dissolve the government, and then the same dudes got elected when he allowed the next government to get going. So finally he was like, look, man, you Richard Henry Lee again? No. We're not doing it. No more government. I'm your government now. Congratulations. And the population, from their perspective, they were like, well, every time you give us government, we know who we want. I don't get what the problem is. So you can see that both sides here are attempting to quell the other. And the king can quell much more effectively than the colonists could. The next big thing to note is that legislative powers are incapable of annihilation, meaning the people at large make their own rules. They might assent to your further rules if you do a good job with them. But if you just say there's no rules, we're making rules and we're enforcing them how we want. So by disbanding the legislatures, you're essentially giving the ability to make rules back to just any individual or any group of people. That might be okay if you got a good group of people and lots of guns to defend against a bad group of people. But if you don't live with cool people, that's really rough. And so you team up and you start making your own rules, and the entire game of creating a government starts from scratch, right? The warlords and small communities that try to be democratic, but it's all small because everybody's fractured. So no matter what, people are going to make the rules. And then the charge of dangers from without and convulsions within, well, the convulsions within is exactly what I was talking about. People start breaking up, and then when some group gets the wild hair that they're going to go and take over what used to be Virginia, you start having convulsions within. People start having civil war to build some new country. And dangers from without. Is there a better time to attack what used to be a state than right after it dissolved and is fighting itself? No better time. It's perfect. So by disbanding the state's legislatures, or the colonies' legislatures at the time, they were exposed to danger. from within and without. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose, obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners. Naturalization of foreigners means foreigners getting citizenship or the path to citizenship. Refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He was making it harder to move there because he was blocking some amount of naturalization, meaning you couldn't get rights when you were there. Even if you traveled across an entire ocean to go to Pennsylvania, you couldn't get rights under his new laws because he didn't want anybody wanting to go there. He also blocked Germans from coming. He blocked a lot of people that wanted to migrate to the States or the colonies at the time. He blocked them from coming there. And they made it more expensive to go there and get land, which also blocks people from coming, right? If you all of a sudden hear this month that land in America is up $1,000 an acre and you only make $200 a year, we're staying in Germany. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. The king was fed up with the colonists getting to do what they wanted, right? So on top of sending over corrupt governors and whatnot, he passed a law where the colonists, via their taxes, could no longer pay for judges and the judicial branch. And instead, he would send over judges. Now you got to think about where this incentive structure leads. If you're paid by the colonists to be a judge, and you'd like to remain a judge, you judge the colonists in a way that the colonists think is fair enough to keep you judging. If the king pays you to be a judge, you judge in a way that makes sure the king thinks you're doing a good job judging. And those two opinions, the king and the colonist, they're very different opinions. So when the king takes away the colonist's ability to pay for the judiciary and makes them dependent on him for all of their money and their houses and their judging, he fundamentally flips what the judges are going to do, or how they're going to judge. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. The king passed a bunch of laws, and the colonists didn't like them. And when the king passed the laws and the colonists didn't comply, he sent over a bunch of dudes to make sure they complied. And then those dudes squeezed the people of extra money. So via taxation, the British were eating their substance, meaning taking their money, taking their food, taking their things. That's all because the king sent these people over from the colonist perspective. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. The king used to get mad at the colonists and send over armies. I mean, that makes some sense. He has affected to render the military independent and superior to the civil power. It's important that your military listens to your government, because when it doesn't, it can become a government of its own, and that is when you have martial law. That has not gone well historically. Military people do not necessarily know how to run a country. They are big fans of boons, and while that's cool when it's not used against you, it's not fun when it's used against you. And oftentimes, if your military is completely detached from your government, your civil power, you have a constant strife between what the military wants, because it's a political entity, and what the government wants, right? And the government doesn't have the kind of guns and bombs and dudes that are trained to use them that the military does. Thankfully, Here in America, the military is subservient to the government, and that's not really been tested since the late 1700s. There were a couple of rebellions, and then, obviously, the Civil War. But other than that, nobody's really trying to overthrow the feds. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. This goes back to the Declaratory Act. Parliament and the king declare that they get to legislate in all cases whatsoever. This complaint is specifically against Parliament. The king is allowing Parliament to legislate for us. They don't live here. Sorry. No. It's worth noting when they say foreign to our Constitution that Constitution in a British sense, semi-written, it's written down because there are laws, but it's unwritten in the sense that they don't just have a book that's called the Constitution that has the rules in it. It's a long history of precedents, and they have to take other rules and get them in line with their current rules and things of that nature. At the time, the rules that were being instituted, the colonists who felt British in some ways, they were British subjects, they felt that their constitution was being violated. They had a constitution within their states, they had certain things that were expected common law rights, and those things were gone now. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Quartering means making them live with. And they didn't directly live in people's houses most of the time, unless they took the house for some reason. They usually lived in unoccupied buildings or made people evacuate and then get in there. But the British did make the American colonists who were under occupation pay for the food and water and housing and all of that stuff of the Brits. Not only was this entire military that you didn't like living in your town, but you had to pay for it. For protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. The king protected the soldiers that killed Americans. He would say he was going to prosecute them, put them on a boat, send them back to England, give them some money, tell them have a good day. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. The British blockaded America after the shots in Lexington and Concord, so we couldn't trade. And we needed money. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. Taxation without representation. That's a repeated theme they're not happy about. For depriving us, in many cases, of the benefits of trial by jury. The king suspended trial by jury because he was tired of the colonists and just told his judges to do what they would, to try him how they would. But if you remember, a couple of charges back in the Declaration, he brings up that the judges are dependent on the king's will. So if the judge thinks the king would rather everybody be convicted, the judge is going to convict everybody. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Just like how he would ship British soldiers to be tried to Britain, he would do that with Americans too. The only difference was the British guy got money and to go home. And the American guy was asked what his defense was. If he didn't bring any papers for his defense, he was just hanged. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. This specific charge is referencing Quebec. So the king took away Quebec's charter, enlarged their borders, and then put in a new government that they didn't necessarily want. Why were the colonists worried about this? He could do that here. He could make it so that Virginia stretched from Maine to Georgia and take away all of the government and institute a brand new one. He did it before. He did it in Canada. Right there. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. Everything in that charge comes from him taking away their charter. The colony had a charter which was their rules and how they organized, and just like a state constitution or a federal constitution. But when the king revokes it, because it's granted by the king, then they don't have rules and laws and stuff like that anymore. Fundamentally, that changes your form of government. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. That's the Declaratory Act again. They were really upset about the Declaratory Act. You can legislate for us whenever? How? I don't know you. That was their feeling. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. The king declared war and just started bombing the people. Why would you listen to him after that? Why do you care if he says your legislature doesn't exist? You're shooting at me. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. The king was burning a lot of stuff. He was burning down towns, and to the king the war had started, so the king was just out there kicking doors and burning floors. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with the circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. Burn, baby. Unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. The king had hired a bunch of Germans to come over and take care of the Americans for him, clean up the mess. As the Germans are efficient at doing, he has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. The British were capturing American ships and then taking the Americans and telling them, congratulations, boys, you're in the British Navy. Woo! And when the Americans were like, nah, we don't really, boom, the Brits were just taking dudes out. So then you realize real quick, I'm a British sailor. And then they were forced to burn down their own villages and go back to America and kill Americans and stuff, or they'll die. So that's rude. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This is going to tie in to the Thomas Jefferson's lost paragraph rather well. But just know that the domestic insurrections that the king was trying to do were slave revolts. He was offering to buy slaves freedom if they revolted against America or the colonies and joined the British, essentially. And the Indian thing, it sounds harsh today, but it's true. They were pulling up, they were cutting people's heads off. They were killing chicks, they were killing kids, they were killing sick people. And at the time, Europeans had a very gentlemanly code of warfare. They weren't about killing kids and women, and they thought it was bad and unholy. It was cool to kill other people. It was kind of a gray area to siege somewhere where then everybody starves, including women and children. But they weren't just out here trying to decapitate ladies. And the Indians were okay with that, at least at the time. And then you'd have reasons for that. I'm not trying to judge. But they were merciless to the Europeans and to the founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson did not like them. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. He used the same line again, but still unfit to be the ruler of a free people. You hear that, king? Terrible. You're a tyrant, a prince. He didn't even call you a king. He called you a prince. What are you going to do? Nothing. You're going to lose the war. That's what's going to happen. When he says in every stage of these oppressions we have petitioned for redress, he means that for the past 15 years we've been talking to you, telling you we don't like what you're doing, complaining, and you have yet to listen. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. I mean, he's going in on the British people. This was initially a letter to the king, and then it was kind of a letter to the parliament, and now it just became a burn on his cousins. He said, you guys haven't listened to us. The conditions of our settlement here is that we're loyal British subjects who should have the free system of English laws and the same rights as you. And you won't listen. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. We are just trying to get them to recognize that their legislator is overstepping. It's doing things to us that we do not approve of. And you guys are the ones with the power right now, and you won't help us. So we're enemies. Until you stop. Then we're friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Thomas Jefferson, and Americans in general, have kind of an obsession with God, manifest destiny. We're predestined to be great, predestined to have God on our side and behind us, blowing our sails, as it were. They were hoping that God would come through in this instance. They wanted everyone to know that they had the best intentions in doing this. And then the final portion, where they say that they're a free and independent state and they may of right contract alliances and do all of those things that states may of right do. That's the to other countries who are maybe looking to see Britain less strong. Hey man, you looking for a weak Britain? We got some guys fighting with muskets over here if you're trying to give us some money. You trying to shoot at some Brits with your ships? Because we don't have ships. They're sending out the bat signal with that last statement. We are pledging together our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So the best of this country are all coming together, and we're going to be hanged as traitors for this. We're in it together, but also we're bound together because everything is getting taken if we lose. So yeah, we're serious. Please help. That's essentially what they're saying. Yeah, we're a state and this is good. It's also a rallying cry for the people. We're our own country, sure. But we're not going to be our own country for long if we have to fight the most powerful military on earth with a couple of dudes that used to be Masons. We got like 15 dudes from the British military. This is going bad, man. We had the militia, but we were not a match for the British military alone. Now, for the lost paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. He has excited domestic insurrections, is one of the charges against the king. And that was actually an edit down from the initial paragraph that Thomas Jefferson wrote about slavery. See, we just think that the king was inspiring whoever to rise up and fight the government. Or maybe you didn't think that, but reading it, that's what you would be led to believe. No, the king was trying to get slaves to revolt. And Thomas Jefferson had an entire paragraph in the Declaration of Independence about the king attempting to get the slaves to revolt, and really how, as he saw it, the score on this whole slavery issue between the king and the colonies. Thomas Jefferson, being an ideologue, was against slavery. He did not think slavery was a good thing. He thought it was a sin. And I think in many ways we can all agree it is America's original sin. Slavery has not gone well in a long-term sense for almost anybody. There are lots of reasons it's reprehensible. But more than anything, Jefferson was locked into a real-world bind. He had inherited this large plantation. He was heavily in debt, and the only way he could maintain any kind of lifestyle was to keep floating the debt with big farm proceeds. The only way to get big farm proceeds was to have slaves because it was expensive to pay white people. While we can look back today and say, yeah, easy for you to say not having, like, there are a lot of things we could say to dismiss it, but genuinely, he was not a fan of slavery. And you'll find that for the most part, even the founding fathers that owned slaves thought it was a terrible practice. They thought it was morally reprehensible. They wished to get rid of it. And the only reason it was introduced into the Constitution is there were a couple of Southerners that really needed it. And I want that to be clear that for the most part, while they may have been racist and they were worried about a biracial society, like they didn't know what that would bring, but nobody knew what it would bring, they didn't think that slavery was good or even morally neutral. They saw it as bad, but in a lot of ways, for a lot of them, a necessary evil. Thomas Jefferson is going to come in and say, actually, slavery in America, that's the king's fault. We didn't want to be in this position, but the king wanted us tobacco and stuff, so. Thomas Jefferson's lost paragraph, edited from a whole paragraph down into a simple domestic insurrections line. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. I like the word thither, means here. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain. to start this slavery paragraph. Thomas Jefferson is calling the king the worst person ever. You have waged war against human nature itself, violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty in a people that live far away and didn't do anything. You captured them, you took them across the world, and if they made it, that's cool, but some of them didn't, and they just died in a boat on the way here. This is some pirate stuff, and you gotta understand that pirate was not a light word at the time. It was like communist in the 50s or racist in 2016. Pirate was explosive. Nobody wanted to be called a pirate. They were seen as the lowest of the low. So to call it piratical warfare, you're acting like a pirate. The opprobrium of infidel powers. Infidel just meaning one that is not faithful to God. So the opprobrium means the worst of. So the worst of the godless powers is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. You're the one who sent all these slaves over here. We didn't want them. We didn't even have them at first. We moved here. And then you liked some of the stuff and you said, we need free labor. So you boated your happy booty on over to Africa and stole people, which is terrible. This is the next part. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this exorable commerce. What he's saying is you are determined. Not only were you bad in the past, but right now you're determined to keep the slave market open. And they tried to ban the slave trade as individual colonies and as a unit. Both times the king said no. So he's helping this slavery grow. And that this assemblage of whores might want, no fact of distinguished, die. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he has also obtruded them. No fact of distinguished, meaning we don't even have to pick a specific thing that's bad about slavery for it to be like the worst thing ever. And now, after you took them, you brought them here. We didn't bring them here. You brought them here. And then we were like, this is terrible. We don't want this anymore. Pass legislation. You said, no, you're going to keep having the slave trade. And you brought more people here. And now, while you're bringing more slaves over here, you are trying to buy their freedom for them by killing us. So you put the problem here, and now you're telling the problem to kill us. That seems unfair. When Thomas Jefferson says, and murdering the people upon whom he has also obtruded them. Obtruded means to impose. So you impose the slavery on us. Sure, some of us are doing rather well because of it. And that's probably not good. But fact of the matter is we tried to ban it. You said no. You keep importing people. So it's almost like you're stealing people to pay them to kill us. And the stealing of the people is terrible, but also, what about us? Paying them to kill us? That's crazy, man. Thus, paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with the crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. You deprived these Africans of every freedom imaginable, of their liberty, of freedom itself. And you're going to have them pay that off. In fact, you're going to wipe it clean on your debt sheet by taking away our lives. It's not to say that the founding fathers, or Thomas Jefferson in particular, was absolved of any wrongdoing, or even should be. He owned many slaves and died poor, so most of those slaves were sold. He had a white wife until he was in his late 30s, I believe. And then after that, he started on a lifelong relationship with a rather young slave woman, who he then eventually freed all of the kids that they had together when he died. And they were not forced to live like a slave life. But he participated in slavery, and he didn't do even remotely his due diligence in attempting to stop it. He was certainly ideologically against it, as almost all of them were, but at the end of the day, their practical situations outweighed their ideologies. Now, this specific paragraph, the lost paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, I think sheds a lot of light on the complicated matter that was slavery and their view of slavery. Why didn't this make the cut? I mean, this was slamming. Why didn't this make the final cut of the Declaration of Independence? Well, some of the members of Congress didn't think that in the document that they all knew at the time was America's rallying cry, America's ethos, a statement of American culture in one document. The slave owners didn't want it to sound like they were fundamentally against slavery, because then how am I going to own my plantation? Despite Thomas Jefferson owning a plantation, he didn't have those reservations. He wrote this. It was edited down to the mere statement, "He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us." All of that, all of the vitriol directed towards slavery, edited down to one simple sentence that conveys almost none of those points, which in a sense was on purpose. But at the same time, I would argue that America's founding ethos actually lines up with this statement. This is an argument that people have made. Americans made this argument while slavery was around, that it was incompatible with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They make it now, looking back. I don't think anybody makes a better case for how bad slavery is than the slave owner, Thomas Jefferson. If you enjoyed that video, like, subscribe, and check me out on Substack, where I write understandamerica.substack.com. Thank you.